Okay, so let's start. Hi, and welcome to the Edinburgh Lectures in Language Evolution. I'm Sid, and I'm a doctoral researcher at the CDT in Natural Language Processing. So I'm here today to introduce our final speaker, who needs no introduction, which makes my job quite redundant. But before I get to that part, I would like to make two announcements. One is that I would like to invite you all to the drinks reception that will take place after the lecture. It's going to happen in room G07 at the Informatics Forum, and it is sponsored by the CDT in Natural Language Processing. And the second announcement is please don't forget that all our lectures are on our YouTube channel, and you can find it on our website. That's l2023.org. So that being said, let me now get to the real reason we're here. I'm honored to introduce to you today Professor Adele Goldberg. Since 2004, Professor Goldberg has been at Princeton University, where she leads the Princeton Psychology of Language Lab and is also a professor of psychology and linguistics. The main thrust of her research focuses on form and meaning, how they're related to each other, and how they're represented in the mind. She's widely known for work on construction grammar and has authored a number of influential publications on the topic. Today, Professor Goldberg will talk to us about language change and what it reveals to us about human language. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Sid. It's such a pleasure to be here. Oh, I'm not able to share my slides yet. No, I think if you stop sharing, I couldn't.
Yeah, sorry, just a technical hitch.
Okay. Okay. And okay. Perfect. So thank you so much for inviting me. I've long admired the Center for Language Evolution in Edinburgh and the department and people there more generally. And I've really enjoyed the first three talks. So what I'm going to focus on today is, the title is Accessibility and Attractor Dynamics Over Historical Times. And that sounds very grandiose, but I'm going to focus on a smaller piece of the puzzle, which is the fact that English speakers used to systematically say uncles and aunts. So in general, my perspective is that our knowledge of language emerges from clusters of lossy, meaning imperfect, memories that relate form and function. And these cluster together in memory, as all memories do, and they're combined on the fly as needed. So again, what I'm going to talk about today is just a tiny corner of the data. So this is this differentiates the talk in some ways from Steve Pantagiosi's talk, who gave us a taste of the future, and Isabel and Balthazar's talks, which were very broad and brought in lots of data from chimps and humans and from languages all over the world. You'll forgive me, but I'm going to start with this tiny piece of data. But I'm going to argue that while the data is very specific, the implications of it are general. So let's start by just asking a very basic question. What is it that language users are trying to do? And I think from that perspective, it becomes very clear that what we need to do is choose forms given our intended message, what we want to convey. And we need to understand other people's messages given the forms that we witness for the sake of comprehension. And it's also important to people that we conform to our language community or communities. So given that very simple observation that I think it's hard to argue with, it becomes clear that what we need to do is learn and use form-function pairings, where function includes meaning, but also discourse function or sociolinguistic function. And learned form-function pairings are what I call constructions. So today I'm going to focus on the fact that constructions are selected based on both the message, primarily the message that you want to convey, but also accessibility. And I'll say a lot more about accessibility in the talk. And this will make connections to some of the earlier talks we heard. But in talking about a small corner of English language, we're going to see that even compositional phrases leave memory traces. And that memory involves clusters, not lists. And from those clusters, emergent subregularities or more general regularities emerge. So I'm going to give you some brief examples of what I mean by constructions. Constructions exist at varying levels of complexity and abstraction. So words are considered constructions. They're technically constructions on this, according to this definition. What's important is that words can be fully filled, they can have open slots, or they might be unfilled. And here are examples of each kind. So evolution, construction, emergence, existence. Notice too that we have these morphological constructions, words that end in shun, words that end in ence. Those two constructions happen to be in competition. You don't find the same meaning existing with both of those forms. And then the unfilled noun compound construction is of course recursive and allows us to produce new utterances or new phrases that we haven't produced before. For instance, Monday morning Edinburgh talk. Just like words are constructions at varying levels of specificity, so are phrasal patterns. So lexically fixed phrasal patterns include idioms like spill tea in whatever tense, hug it out, or okay boomer. Phrasal constructions or idioms sometimes have open slots that are somewhat constrained. So for example, I don't know who or I don't know which people need to hear or see this. And then we also have somewhat idiosyncratic constructions that have mostly open slots, like the more you think about it, the less you understand construction, or the comparative construction. And of course, also constructions are like argument structure constructions, the passive construction, all kinds of information structure constructions like relative clauses, topicalization, clefs are all constructions. So the idea is that they're all the same basic type of entity. And so in context, what we need to do to express our messages is access and combine the constructions needed to express our message. So we need to access the relevant constructions in order to express them. So our memory is content addressable. So that's a term from computer science, but it basically means that we can access our memory based on many different factors. When we're speaking, our primary query is the message. We want to express some kind of message. And so we're able to access the relevant constructions based on the message. That's the most important thing, by far, hands down, the message. But beyond that, we also have the constructions that we end up using have to, of course, be accessible, or we couldn't use them. And accessibility can be of the whole pattern, if we can access the whole from memory. If not, we're going to access the parts and combine them on the fly. But again, the memories are not lists, they're clusters. And increasing cluster strength is what leads to emergent generalizations in language. So what is this tiny corner? Okay, so let me ask you first, if you're understanding this talk, I assume you speak English or understand English well enough, you probably prefer one of these orders in each pair over the others. So do you prefer table and chairs, or chairs and table, sun and moon, or moon and sun, apple and blueberry, or blueberry and apple? And I think most of you will agree that the first option in each pair is judged more acceptable or more natural sounding. And it turns out that these preferences tend to remain stable across people. So that is, I know what most of you will converge on. They also tend to be stable across time. So for example, this is using the Google Books Ngram viewer. So if we just take random examples like table and chairs versus chairs and table, you can see the frequency fluctuates. These are percentages of the examples in the corpus, but the blue line stays above the pink line here. That's true for sun and moon versus moon and sun. Sun and moon is preferred, and that stays above the moon and sun over time. If we look across languages, we see that phrases like uncles and aunts, which is in blue, I know it's tiny, but you just need to see that the blue line is and remains higher than the pink line. Blue line in each language is the translation of uncles and aunts, and the pink line is aunts and uncles in Russian, German, Italian, and Spanish. Here's the puzzle, and this honestly kept me up at nights for several months. This is the pattern in English for these examples. They switch. People systematically used to say uncles and aunts or uncle and aunt, and today that's very rare. You'd be much more likely to say aunt and uncle. You can see the crossover. It's not just aunt and uncle. Maybe that would be some kind of, who knows, a fluke. But we see the same pattern in ma and pa. It used to be that people said pa and ma systematically. But today, if you say it at all, you'd say ma and pa. People used to say nephews and nieces. But today we say nieces and nephews. And again, today we are more likely to say mother and father. But years ago, this goes down to 1900, we were far more likely to say, English speakers were far more likely to say father and mother. So why the change? And why among these, we can call them binomial, so two noun phrases, a conjunction. Why these and not other binomials? Okay, well, one possibility, since they're about male and female ordering, is that perhaps social forces, the change in women's status, maybe that had something to do with it. And there's a lovely study by Molin who looked at this, and she didn't look at exactly the same examples as I did. She looked at the most frequently occurring male and female pairs, and here's a list of them. Now, these will be in order, so Mr. and Mrs. is at the top. What you can see here, so this is across time from 1810s to the 2000s. And what you can see is the percentage of male first terms over time. The 50% line would indicate a switch from male first to female first. And what she pointed out in this paper was at the beginning, the male terms tended to be steadfastly 100%. But around 1970, you got some movement there. But what I want you to notice is that there's almost no crossover in this graph. People still preferred either male first at the top or female first for just these two examples at the bottom. Only one crossover is included in this data set, and that was that fathers and mothers became mothers and fathers. And that happened around 1970. So are social changes responsible? If we think about it, we might expect that phrases like husband and wife might change to be used to become wife and husband more if the social factors were at play. We might think that it's less likely that nephews and nieces would become nieces and nephews. Here's another example that did not change. So let me just say it did not change. Husband and wife and husband is still almost at zero. Sisters and brothers didn't cross over, even though there was a big effort to change that in the United States with famous album. Anyway, it didn't change. So the question is, why did some change and not others? Why was it that uncles and aunts became aunts and uncles? And pa and ma became ma and pa. But these other examples didn't. So social factors, I don't want to say they played no role, but they can't explain the exact nature of the shift. What I did with a student, Crystal Lee, was look at all of 45 pairs of male and female relations. So Mr. and Mrs. is at the top and Pop and Mom is at the bottom. What you're going to see is the direction of change from the male first, which is all on the left, to the female first, which is all on the right. And what you're going to see in the middle is 2 years, both 1930, which is before the shift, and 2010, which is after. So what you're going to notice is that some at the bottom just didn't exist before 2010, or well, they didn't occur in 1930, I should say. And so they are already female first. But you see that nothing went in the opposite direction. There's a whole range of cases in the middle here that systematically moved rightward toward female first, and many crossed that line. But at the top, and I should say, the size of the circle or triangle indicates the frequency of that item. Other examples didn't change, okay? And now this gives you a clue that the examples that didn't change might be higher frequency. Okay, so I can say a little more. Turned out, I finally was able to sleep when I realized that the first one that sort of became clear in the corpus data was mother and daddy and mother and dad. So what you can see here is as early as they began being used at all, this phrase mother and daddy, mother came before daddy. And this was very early. By 1920, everyone was saying mother and daddy, and almost no one was saying daddy and mother. Why would that be? Well, you might wonder, well, maybe it has something to do with the meaning. Today, the phrase is hardly ever used. Mother and daddy sounds kind of weird. So we can ask, why was this word order preferred initially? And it really didn't have to do with the meaning, I don't think. So this is a typical example of how it was used early on. So this was in 1916, and it says, it's from a novel. I have been to see Mrs. Lawrence, said Anita, and she asked me if I would write a letter for her. She didn't, of course, tell me not to say anything about it to you, mother and daddy, but I would rather not tell you to whom the letter is to be written. You must trust me, my dear own daddy. So it's the daddy who has authority here. It's not that the mother is more powerful. And then she goes on and then says, in the line at the bottom, she switches to father and mother because that is the more common order. So it seems like it's almost interchangeable here. Well, it turns out that dad and daddy had been around, but were almost never used. And then as they became more, as they became used with mother, mother was by far the more accessible word. That is, mother it was all along roughly 150 times more frequent than either daddy or dad. And so when people were accessing this new combination, again, because daddy hadn't been in wide circulation, so they were creating it. As they were creating this new combination, mother was so much more frequent, it was easier to access. So there are decades of studies showing that more frequent words are more accessible than less frequent words. That seems to be why this phrase became used. Now, okay, so that's a hint, but did an increase in frequency of female terms across the board then cause the shift? Did people start using all of the female terms more than they had? No, that's not the answer. So uncle has always been and still is more frequent than aunt, but we still say aunt and uncle. And women actually did increase in frequency relative to men, but we still say men and women, and that has really not budged. So let's think more about this idea of cognitive accessibility. Accessibility of memory traces, and this is not just about language, this is in general. How do we access our memories? Well, memory is content addressable. We can identify the memory we want to most of the time. So the match to the intended message or whatever it is you're searching for in memory is the strongest thing that makes a memory accessible. But another thing that strengthens memory is a cluster of semantically related cases. So it's easier to remember the zoo if you've had many different trips to the zoo. Token frequency, similarly, the more often you've done something, the easier it is to access. How relevant or important it is like the match to intended message, I think, that it hones you in on exactly the message or exactly the memory you want to access. And I think here's where I can make some content with, I think, what Isabel and Balthazar were finding, that animate or causal agents are more important to us. So both Isabel and Balthazar showed examples where it wasn't about language, it was about visual attention. And you could see that animate agents were more, our attention is naturally drawn to those. So they increase accessibility. And then what decreases accessibility is interference from a competitor that has the identical meaning that we want to convey, because the other form is going to jump up instead, it's going to be more active instead. And some of these ideas should be familiar to you. I have some references at the bottom. I know priming is, a huge source of studies there in Edinburgh. So we need to access appropriate constructions to express our intended message. So we need to match our intended message. Memory is content addressable. And in this particular case, we're controlling pretty much for meaning, because aunt and uncle is pretty much the same thing as uncle and aunt. So then what becomes important is the salience to the speaker. And actually, Cooper and Ross made this famous in an old study where they described a me first principle for these conjunctions, these binomial word orders. They said male first, agent first, large first, alcoholic first. But all of this really was getting at something that was serious, which was that things that are more salient to us are more accessible. Agents, animates, causers, movers, things that are large, things that are familiar, things that are important. So we say sun and moon and not moon and sun. We say table and chairs. These are the larger, more important, less movable, or more anchored, I should say, entities. Vodka and soda, it's more important, the vodka. Chase and flee, you wouldn't say flee and chase normally. This was an example from Isabel. And I think you would say Scotland and England if you're there in Edinburgh, because Scotland is just more relevant to you. So how could we show this? We actually showed this in a study. This was done with Karina Tachihara, who graduated a couple of years ago and is now a postdoc with Fernando Ferreira. So she had people, we wanted to get away from the effect of frequency in the language and just to get at familiarity to the individual. And so we asked people to simply name 3 couples that they know. And this was out of context, so we're controlling for animacy. We're also controlling for what's given in the discourse, because there is no discourse. And she asked English speakers and Japanese speakers. So Japanese famously has a different word order than English, but in conjunctions, A and B can mean the same thing as B and A in these cases. Okay, so she asked them for names of couples that they know. And then afterwards, she asked them, which one are you closer to? So if they said Gary and Jesse, she would ask them which one are you closer to. The word order was varied it was randomly ordered. And then she'd also ask them what gender is that person. So the outcome variable is the word order, which one was used first. And what you can see is the closeness, how close people felt to the person was a big influence. These are beta values in a mixed model linear regression, generalized linear model. These are the effect sizes of closeness in both languages. They're way above 0, positive. The more close you are to the person, the more close you feel to the person, the more likely you are to utter their name first. Length had almost no effect in either language. It wasn't significant. Gender, so a male first bias was significant in both languages. You can see it's smaller than the closeness variable. Okay, so there is some male first bias in both languages, even now. Okay, so now we might ask, well, is it that people feel closer to female relatives today than they used to? So I haven't published this, but I did a little online survey asking people to imagine whether other people felt closer to a sister or a brother or a niece or a nephew and so on. And people do tend to feel somewhat closer to female relatives, pretty much across the board. But that includes examples that didn't shift. It includes sisters and brothers. People feel closer to girls over boys. And it didn't correlate with age. So it's not that it seems to have changed over historical time. It's not like older people felt less close to female relatives and only young people feel closer to female relatives today. So closeness isn't the answer to this puzzle of why we have this systematic shift in English for some, but not all examples. So here's just an example. Brothers and sisters didn't shift. It's still favored over sisters and brothers. Okay, so where are we? We've asked, is the shift from systematic male first cases to a cluster of cases that are female first, is it attributable to increased frequency of the female terms? Well, no, it isn't. Is it attributable to social forces? No, it isn't. In fact, social forces might say women are more powerful, but presumably women have always been, or say mothers have been more important to children over time. And yet people systematically used to say fathers and mothers. And they didn't change Mr. and Mrs., husband and wife, man and woman, the cases that might shift due to, that you might think might shift due to social forces. So that's not the explanation. And is it attributable to increased closeness? No, not as far as we can see. So where are we? Well, remember, memories are clusters. They're not lists. So here's where we started. In 1800, everything was systematically male first. That male first bias that still exists in when we name names of couples was systematic across the board. These were all pronounced these ways. So blue is going to indicate male first. The size of the border is a simple indication of frequency. Okay. Well, around 1910, Mother and Daddy came on the scene, and it then had a ripple effect. Similar cases became drawn into the pattern, and you can see that Ma and Pa was the first one to move. Now, why was it the first one to move? Well, it was formally similar, starting with Ma and Pa, or sorry, at least Ma. The meaning was very similar. Ma and Pa and Mother and Daddy are very close in meaning. And also, Ma and Pa had not been very frequent. So it wasn't so entrenched as Pa and Ma. Another way to say that is the competitor way to say it, Pa and Ma, was not that strong. So it flipped. Once it flipped, you had a growing cluster. Then aunts and uncles, another example that wasn't that frequent, shifted. So it used to be uncles and aunts, but it got drawn into the pattern. Now we're talking 1960. Grandma and grandpa got sucked in. Here there's a formal and semantic relationship, but with Pa and Ma. Then nieces and nephews got drawn in. Mother and father was fairly late because that was a more frequent case, but once the cluster grew in strength, it drew in more examples. And then grandmother and grandfather is a more recent addition. And these other cases, first of all, they're not as related, they're not as tightly semantically related as the others because they're not talking about relatives. They're not talking about the same kind of relational terms. And several of them also have high frequency, especially men and women, boys and girls. So they have not shifted. So what we wound up with is this cluster, the cluster of cases here in pink. And that's sort of a just so story until you can show it with modeling data. And so that's what we did. We can model the change, again, with those same 45 binomials, getting the relative frequency at each decade. And then here's what is important. Okay, so the probability of pronouncing A and B as opposed to the reverse is the cognitive accessibility of A relative to B. So if A is much more accessible, that is much more frequent, you might expect it to be first. You also have, and this is going to be a negative influence, competition from the reverse order, because that has exactly the same meaning. That's the competition. Okay, and then the third thing is the interesting thing here, which is the cluster strength of cases related to A and B. That is semantically and phonologically related, so we'll call them A prime and B prime. Okay, so we can make this a little more specific by saying the cognitive accessibility of A minus the cognitive accessibility of B. The competition is going to be the log frequency of the reversed order, and then the cluster strength. But let me be a little more specific still. So bear with me. There's a teeny bit of math here, but it's trivial. So the relative accessibility is going to be the log frequency of the female term minus the number of syllables of the female term, because we know length matters for accessibility. Again, decades of psycholinguistic studies have shown us that. And then we're going to subtract for that because we want to know the relative accessibility of the female versus the male term. We're going to use the log frequency of the masculine minus the length of the masculine term. And we're going to add one because we know there's a male first bias, which probably has to do with the fiction that males are more important or active or maybe just bigger. But we see that across languages that for whatever reason, males are more, there is a male first bias. So we just added a 1 to indicate that. For competition, very simply, we use the log frequency of the reversed order, okay? So for familiar conjunctions, familiar binomials, the frequency of the alternative order is going to be the thing that matters the most. And then for cluster strength, we simply added up the degree of semantic similarity between the two cases, or sorry, between the potential case and the existing cases, however many there were, together with the morphological similarity of the existing case and all the other cases, however many there were at that decade. And we did this for each decade to try to predict the changes. And what we found was that each of these factors, this is the punchline, each of these factors did have a significant influence, and it was super clear. So the relative accessibility of the individual terms, competition from the alternative order, which is stored as a unit, because you have that frequency of the combination that matters, and the cluster strength, because memory is not lists. There are other examples of clusters, of course. So Benoit and Levy in a different context, but they pointed out that you have a lot of these cases that seem to be anchored with one word. So nice and easy, nice and warm, nice and clean. If you're going to coin a new one, nice and has become a partially filled lexical construction or phrasal construction. Sit and with a verb, similar. Good and bad, good and evil, good and ready, good and decent, and so on exist. And more generally, a lot of us have talked about constructional families. And here I just mentioned 3 that I've worked on: resultatives with Ray Jackendoff, the number one and the anaphoric one, which together form a family of constructions that I worked on with Laura Michaelis, and a new constructor that I hope will come out in language. And it's about a family of constructions that involve phrases used as words, used as lemmas. And I also found this wonderful paper by Isabel and Steve, 2 of our speakers, who point out that word form similarity increases with semantic similarity across languages. Another indication that memories cluster, language clusters. And so before I reach the end, I just want to point out that I'm not saying that accessibility of the words determines word order directly. That's clearly not true. If it were true, we wouldn't be able to have two different constructions, like had I more time, da 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 da, da, or I had more time. They mean very different things. The first one implies I did not have more time. And the only difference is the word order. So the message is the key thing that narrows down our search space and allows us to access particular memories. What we want to say is the most important, and that can involve constructions at any level of abstraction and complexity. Similarly, he got dressed and took a shower doesn't mean the same thing as he took a shower and got dressed, because we know that word order matters when there's a temporal progression. And we respect that because the meaning is most important. Okay, so does the accessibility of words determine word order directly? No, message is what determines accessibility. Okay, so beyond the message though, once we've fixed the message that we want to convey, everything we know about memory influences accessibility. And here we turn to psychologists as well as linguists to tell us how memory works. Clusters influence accessibility, and competition negatively impinges on accessibility. If there's a different way to say it that's more accessible, we're more likely to use that different way if it means the same thing. Okay, so we choose constructions on the basis of our intended message, accessibility. So if we have the whole combination, it's a familiar expression, we're going to access it directly, the whole thing. If we don't have the whole thing put together to express our message, we're going to access the parts and combine them on the fly. The interference from the competitor with the same function is going to also play a role in what we say. It's a winner takes all in production, whatever is more accessible if both options express the identical message. Okay, and this is the way in which similar constructions cluster together and over historical time can lead to emergent regularities or subregularities in language. Okay, so that's my little image of our knowledge of language. And I'll just thank Karina Tachihara, who's on the job market now. She's amazing. Fernanda Ferreira, who did the work on Good Enough Production with me. Krista Lee, who's currently a graduate student here. Thomas Earps, Shahar Schertz. And I also really want to thank Kenny and Henry for organizing this wonderful workshop, and for Isabel, Steve, and Balthazar for the fabulous talks. And these are my current construction workers at Princeton. And thank you very much for attending.
Thanks, Adele. So people can ask questions online. And we can have questions from the room as well, but I'll come to our panelists first. Balthazar, questions or comments from you?
Yeah, thanks, Adele. This is really wonderful. A very nice example of shift in progress. That's really cool. I really appreciate the emphasis you lay on the production side as driven by the message. I think that's absolutely critical. Now, one thing that I'm not sure I fully understood is that there's all this literature on phonological neighborhood density that affects our access, and it seemed to me like you went into this at some point by saying like the semantic similarity and the morphological similarity, which is also like neighborhood density issues to some extent from a processing perspective, but there seems to have been an opposition between that and accessibility per se in the way you set up your regression model, and I wasn't quite sure how you would combine these, because from a classical psycholinguistic point of view, you could say, well, there's a ton of factors that influences like what you access when, and clearly the clusters and the neighborhood densities matter, the message matters, the context matters and whatnot, but it's all about access. and I thought you were trying to make a difference between that and other factors. And can
Well,
you
no, I do think it's all about access after you take the message into account. I mean, the message rules the day. Accessibility doesn't rule the day, because we don't just say I, which is the most accessible word to most of us. So the message helps us narrow down what we're searching for, the search space, which the message, you could think of it as making the particular constructions more accessible. I think that is what happens. But without the message, you can't appeal to just mechanistic frequency kinds of information. But the cluster is a positive influence. The cluster helps you access the memory for the sake of production.
But in the way you set up your model, you had, if memory serves me right, you had on the one hand frequency issues and prosodic issues about length, and then separate from that the cluster effect as two different.
I so appreciate
terms.
that you. I so appreciate that you paid close attention. That's great.
And that's the puzzle I have. Why separate these, right? Because frequency and semantic similarity and so on, you could also think of them as like really working in tandem.
Okay, so these are different factors. Good.
Yeah.
It's great. I'm delighted that you've attended to this, because I think this is really the key part. So notice for individual terms. So we know what we're going to talk about. We know we're going to access, the message is fixed. We're going to access the male and female terms. If it's a novel case, we're going to decide the order based on the accessibility of those two terms. And that's true like in the naming couples we know, for instance. So in the naming couples we know, the frequency of the words is going to matter. The length is going to matter. And then masculine is going to get a little bit of an edge. Okay, but the competition is a negative influence. So the beta is negative here. This is competition. This is the log frequency of the alternative combination. So the first one is the log frequency of the individual terms. This is the log frequency of the combination. And the cluster is again positive. And we didn't include the frequency of the items in the cluster. If that's what you're getting at, that's true. We could add that here. So we could weight this. So what we have here is just a simple sum of the combination of semantic and morphological similarity. That worked in the model. It could well work better if we included additionally for each of these existing female first terms, their frequency. But we didn't do that.
Well,
so I don't know. They weren't. Yeah.
So for me, the question was more like why, for instance, the prosodic weight in number of syllables is combined together with the log frequency of the individual items. And you subsume this onto one coefficient that you want to estimate, because an alternative way would be, say, like prosodic weight. We know it plays a big role, so that's one term. The base frequency is another term. The phonological similarity to other notions is yet another term. But you seem to have like a strategic way of combining prosody with log frequency, but semantic similarity with morphological. I was just trying to understand why you did it the way you did.
Yeah, okay, so there is a theoretical idea behind this, and that is that when you go to pronounce a binomial, you're going to grab the whole thing at once if it's familiar. And we know that because the order is fixed, even when frequency and weight don't determine it. But when you ask, how did it get fixed that way? Well, weight and frequency had played a role, but you're not always doing it anew. If you were, then these cases wouldn't have shifted. So like you wouldn't be able to have this semantic similarity to the fixed cases if you didn't have any fixed cases. If you were always doing it on the fly, like, okay, I'm gonna say something and it has to do with a male and female term, and I'm going to grab them from memory depending on their frequency, their length, and each of their independent accessibility, there's no reason you would have a change. So that's the puzzle that I really sat with for months.
Mhm.
It can't just be the accessibility of the terms on their own. So you have to be remembering the whole when it's familiar. And that's the log frequency of the competitor. And when because father and mother was so frequent, it was slow to change because that competitor was pretty strong. Only when it was counterbalanced by the weight of the cluster, the growing cluster, did it get sucked in. But the individual terms didn't change in weight. Remember, mother didn't become more, the female terms didn't become more salient. People didn't feel more close to them. They always felt close to the female terms. They didn't become more frequent. They didn't become longer. The accessibility of the individual terms didn't shift, which really goes to show you that we're remembering the whole, which isn't a surprise because we do remember wholes, even when they're compositional. But I thank you for letting me try to explain that, because that is really part of the heart of this.
Isabel.
Yes, thank you, Adele. That was very fun, actually. You started to say that it's a small case and things, but I found it very fun to hear about. I have very simple and naive questions. Is that type of shift also visible in other languages around the same time, or is it something? No. Okay.
Yeah,
that is
no,
something
that's a
in
great
English.
question. So I should say, Molen has done some other work in German papers from academia where they're purposefully talking about, like they're laying down the rules. So in that context, there has been a shift, and that is clear as like more purposeful, intentional to try to switch to make the female first. But at large, no, there hasn't been a shift. And so one of the questions online is, it sounds like there's no particular pressure, no functional pressure for this shift. And that's right. Like, I love functional pressures, but I don't think this was a functional pressure. I think mother and daddy came because mother was more frequent, dumb reason, but that's the way it became fixed. Once it was fixed, it started attracting new cases. And the more it attracted, the bigger it grew. Yeah, so I think that's another kind of general moral. I love that you're drawing out these points, because the other moral is that, like, it's memory. Memory is really what we need to study.
I think that's interesting, because I am now questioning whether some of the patterns that we see and that we may attribute some type of functional pressure due to, I don't know, well, frequency is a bit silly, because it seems to be like a garbage Bible, because it's linked to so many things at the same time, including accessibility, but it's everything at the same time. It's a bit difficult to disentangle. But I feel like what you just suggest is that yes, this is no functional pressure, but still we see a drift through time about this. And I'm just wondering whether some of the phenomenon that we are looking at and are trying to explain through the length of functional pressure may just be actual, just this type of drift that we may see. Not because of function, just because it's the way memory is working.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, no, I'm just
no, I do agree. And I don't know that frequency is a garbage bag. I mean, it's very easily measurable, and it's very important. And so
yeah. But it's
right. So I think you and I agree we would ignore it at our peril, right? So and the other thing about frequency that I just want to point out, I didn't strongly make this case, but in 2006, I said something like constructions are any combinations of are learned pairings in form and function that have sufficient frequency. And then sometime after that, I realized that doesn't even make sense. What is it? What do you mean that you you retain it when it has sufficient frequency. How does it ever get sufficient frequency? You have to be retaining a memory trace of it, even the first time you hear it, for some amount of time, at least some of the time, for the frequency to accrue. So every experience is going to change those weights, is going to leave a little bit of a memory trace every time you hear it. You can only access it. You can only recall it when it has sufficient memory, sufficient frequency. But it has to have some effect, or you couldn't accrue frequency. So yeah, I think our memory is really dynamic. At the same time, you know, things are very conventionalized. It's not like we're just spitting out. That's the point I want to make with this model. It's not that we're just spitting out what's accessible first. We're not. That plays a role. What's accessible plays a role, but our message is more important. And once things become conventional, we access them as a whole. And it's the frequency of the whole that matters, not the frequency or the accessibility of the individual parts, I would say.
I ask another question on that. I mean, a perennial issue in frequency measures is that they are always conditioned by context. And, you know, when the learning and everything is always conditional, it's always like, to what extent something is predictable or not given a context. And I was wondering to what extent you think that for these is an open question, really, I don't know, like for these historical processes, to what extent does this have actually an impact on how things get, you know, conventionalized and so on, regularized? Or do you think this is a matter of just like raw frequency in a sense? It can be from a psycholinguistic point of view, but then from a historical point of view, maybe it is. I don't know.
No, I think that's another excellent question. I think context is directly part of your message, right? So, you know, you want to express a message in context. You're not trying to say something true directly about the world. You know, in a context where you're in a more formal context, you might choose purchase. In a relaxed context, you might choose buy. It's not like purchase is never said, even though it's lower frequency. It is said because it has a different connotation. In certain other contexts, you're going to use a different language. So context. So I think this really goes to the idea that memory is content addressable, meaning it's not like everything's vying for attention at once. Context narrows it down, what we're attending to, what's more active than what. Our message narrows it down much further, more directly. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, but I mean, it's clear that, you know, once you've seen something in multiple contexts, somehow you realize, oh, maybe the particular context doesn't matter. And so it becomes general. I don't think you have to witness it in every single context in order to use it in every single context. So if I could just say one more follow-up about that. There was you remember the old debate about the past tense and whether we store the regulars? Well, now we know we stored the regulars. They have an impact. But the question that was raised early on, I think by Steve Pinker, was, you know, how is it that we know that we can say plumped? Plumped is not, it doesn't obey the phonotactic constraints of English. It's not like we've heard anything phonologically similar to it. And yet we know we can use the past tense. And I would say what we've learned by learning enough instances of the regular past tense, by memorizing them, if you will, not in a list, but as clusters, is that phonology doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So any phonology will do.
Okay.
Some dimensions matter, some dimensions don't matter.
I've got at least 5 questions lined up here. So I'm gonna jump through these. So we'll take a quick one. I'm gonna paraphrase this a little bit. This was from online, and then we'll do some from the room. So this question, the first question online, you've already answered one question by Sig, who was asking about whether there's a function for this shift, and you already answered that one. So the next question from online was by Peter Shigetvari, who says, I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but he says, my impression is that in some cases, vocalism of the two parts influences their order. Front vowels first, back vowels last. And then he has some examples of this that might exemplify this pattern in English and Hungarian. And he says, well, if that's true, then this would be the predicted order for Old English. So the more general question is can you also have like phonological factors feeding in on top of frequency and the other factors, except like the kind of closeness to self and so on?
So yeah, great question. You can systematic analyses of the English cases, like by Emily Morgan and Roger Levy, have indicated that it's a very small effect. I mean, in our data, if you remember, with Karina Tachihara, length was not a strong effect. Other factors matter more. Yeah, we didn't look for phonology, but it's not as strong as the other ones for this case. It certainly matters like for past tense, and it also matters for the double object construction. So phonology definitely can matter, and it may have enough effect to make a difference. But you know, it's also possible to understand day and night to be in that order, because day is much more important than night usually.
Okay, thank you. Right, going to take a couple of questions from the room. I'm going to go Annie first, and then Simon. So Annie.
Do I yell?
Yeah, yell and we'll see if they can hear you.
Hi Adele, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thanks for a lovely talk. I had a question about what your thoughts are about these competitors when we're talking about a bilingual or multilingual language system. So how can you imagine the sort of interplay between that affecting the kind of competition in these changes that we see? Because like I speak a second language that I think might have undergone a similar shift to what you're mentioning here.
What language is that?
Swedish.
Okay.
Because like I have at least an intuition that like it's like father and mother is like an archaic order, and mother and father is like a more modern one. And also for lots of the others, like aunt and uncle, we have a more like compositional system for those words as well, right? So the words for mother and father and brother recur in aunt and uncle. That's how we like compositionally create those words, like mother and brother. So I feel like if there's a shift there, it could be a very interesting thing to look at. And I'm thinking about it from a bilingual point of view as well, because the data that you're using, lots of that data will be produced by speakers of English where English is not their native language. And so how much of that shift is also coming from the potentiality of like non-native speakers of English that have a different order for these in their native language, then like picking up on the fact that this is happening in English and sort of speeding that along?
Well, that's a great question. That's a complicated question. I'd love to know more about Swedish, but it's interesting. Yeah, if they're morphologically complex, then they might be more considered more similar, and so more likely to be to pattern alike. About the data, you know, yeah, it could be anything, but the trend is clear, and presumably we had some combination of native and non-native speakers throughout that period. I don't know, it's possible. Usually language change is, you know, idioms can be adopted from another language, but usually the change in word order is not, but I don't know that much about it. It would be, it's possible, but it's such a limited particular case. You know, if there, I don't know if there had been, I mean, it could be that the English case affected Swedish. If the Swedish speakers were listening to a lot of English radio or TV, that seems more likely than to have all of English switch because of Swedish. But just your point about bilinguals, I think bilinguals is a clear case where the context matters, right? And part of the context is what language am I speaking, where the network of construction, those clusters, are kept separate in the two languages, if as long as the person isn't always code switching, because there's more similarity within a language, phonologically, morphologically, structurally, and so there are generally more clusters than you have across the languages. This is a point that Brian McWhinney makes to try to explain how people keep languages separate and use them separately when they do.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder if it would be worth just like having a sort of judgment-based thing. So like how acceptable are these orders? And then like comparing speakers of language where the order is reversed, but bilingual speakers of English, just to see like maybe there is more overlap there than we think, and maybe possibly because they are collocations, also making them sort of more similar across the language systems. Anyway, super interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a great topic. In fact, Karina Techahara did some work for her thesis exactly on that idea, like bilingual speakers, or especially adult learners of English, judgments of sentences. And she found that the interesting thing was they tended to be more lenient. They tended to not judge things as odd as monolingual English speakers or English dominant speakers did. So and her speculation about why this might be true is really fascinating. And I'll just mention it. The idea would be that when you're speaking a non-dominant language, you have to inhibit your first language, your dominant language. But the way that this competition works is also through inhibition. And it could be that if you're inhibiting all of your first language, it's harder to inhibit things in the other language. An example of that is how if you're somewhat less fluent in a second or third or fourth language, and you're in another country, some other language pops up, but it might not be the right one. I don't know if you've had that experience, but.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thanks for
yeah, thank you. Really interesting question. Thank you.
Next question from Simon.
Hi, Adele. Thanks so much for wonderful talk. One of the topics that many of us here in Edinburgh are interested in, particularly for a long time, Jenny Culbertson and I, has been cross-category word order harmony, and where the tendency for different constructions to pattern their modifiers on the same side of the head across languages. And I was thinking about an explanation for that could be similar to the one you set out here, where similarity across these different modifiers and different heads would lead languages to want to pattern them on the same side. One of our students, Fang Wang here, has shown recently that effect is modulated by semantic similarity, which it struck me as exactly the sort of prediction that you would want to make. Is that right?
Yeah, so for sure. Well, at least in this kind of domain, yeah, like for past tense, meaning doesn't matter. It's all phonology because the meaning is just fixed and applies to all kinds of verbs. But when meaning matters, like this case and most constructions, then absolutely. But for the kinds of word order patternings I know that you have looked at and are doing such cool work on, I also wonder about, well, yeah, grammaticalization processes, which this is historical change, but that would make things even more fixed. Or Bybee's early work on word order and the fact that it's often iconic. So the things that are semantically closer are closer together in the string, which I don't think people set out to be iconic, but I think that it probably helps processing, right? If you need to interpret these things together, it helps if they're close.
Right. So that would be an explanation for things like the kind of noun phrase, modifier, relative order.
Right, or adjective ordering, right.
But this would be more like, the classic where if you're an OV language, then you're more likely to have postpositions, for example. So that kind of,
I always
pre or post modifiers.
So it's certainly possible, Simon, but I always wondered, we know that verbs often, or preposition often evolve from verbs. Like in Chinese, they're still transparently related to verbs. And insofar as that's true, then it wouldn't be surprising that the verbs and prepositions are in the same order because they were the same.
That's a plausible hypothesis, but what we can do in the lab experiments we do is show that that's not, well, that may be true, but we can actually see the effect of harmony even in participants using artificial languages or using silent gesture and so on. So we do get that harmonic patterning even without needing a historical explanation like that.
Okay, and have you tested Farsi speakers?
Not Farsi, but we are going through a variety of different languages with different orders, and we
because you know famously Farsi has the very verb final and preposition.
Well, I'll send you Fang's papers, but I think it's actually pretty supportive of an idea of analogy across constructions.
So that's right. I mean, I do think that this is how generalizations emerge in language. I don't think they have to be, like, I don't know that we can't, you know, that it's our memory for language is really strong, but I think this is a natural tendency for things to come to align, like a leveling sort of situation. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take one online question, and then Bob, and then a question at the back, and then we might be out of time. Thanks for waiting. Okay, so I think this is possibly a comprehension check. I think you might already have answered this, but the question is: the explanation for the generation of the first binomial mother and daddy is quite clear, and so is the explanation for the late ones after the cluster is large enough. However, how do you explain the formation of the early cluster, say the second binomial that joined mother and daddy? Why did it join the first one?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think so that as far as we can reconstruct, it's ma and pa, which flip from pa and ma. And I think it's because it wasn't so high frequency. So the whole unit, which would have been pa and ma, didn't have such strong entrenchment, or wasn't such a strong competitor, so it was easier to change that one. And my guess is that it involved priming, that there were contexts where people were saying mother and daddy, and they then in that context started saying pa and ma and pa, because in that context the female first might prime it. That might have been the initial kinds of cases. I can't reconstruct that, but that would be my guess.
Okay, thank you. Right, Bob.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to phonology. Peter Seegethar's question. It occurred to me that one way you might be able to get at the contribution of phonology. You talked about universal or widespread things like male first, large first, more salient first. To try to find as many of these binomials where they don't have any intrinsic thing like that. And one that I thought of was black and white as opposed to color. Because so in English it's black and white, in Romanian it's albi negru, so it's white and black. And it strikes me that one comes about as close as possible to being semantically, pragmatically arbitrary. If you looked at a bunch of languages, you might be able to get ideas about phonological features, length. I mean, so in Romanian albi negru, you've got monosyllable, disyllable. Maybe that's important or not. But that looking for, as I say, relatively unweighted, otherwise unweighted binomials might be a way, and looking cross-linguistically might be a way of getting at any phonological effects that are there.
No, that's a great point. Or to make up words. Right, to make up words with different phonology and then have people order them spontaneously.
That's yeah. Too. Yeah, I mean, I say I was having a hard time thinking of any other pair that where there was really not very much intrinsic intrinsic basis for preferring one first to the other, any intrinsic basis in accessibility or whatever. But I can't think of any others right now. But yeah,
Right.
but I say looking across languages where presumably the phonological form is going to be relatively arbitrary will give you a chance to look at, you know, first consonants or syllable count or just whatever.
Do you think would you expect it to be the same across languages, or might it depend on the phonotactics and how frequently some combinations are used in that language?
It might, but what I'm saying is, I mean, you immediately went to length as a possible phonological factor. And this might be a way of showing that. And it might allow you to observe other things like, you know, maybe obstruents are more salient than sonorants or something. I mean, that was the first thing I thought of with aunt and uncle, but you know, they both beginning with vowels. But I say I don't know what they might be, but it might give you a chance to identify some features that are relatively purely phonological.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, that's I hope someone does that work. Yeah, I don't know if I'll do it, but just because I'm not a phonologist, but I think there's a lot to do.
Anyway,
thank you.
Question from right at the back.
I was thinking, you said that these shifts didn't occur in other languages. I think we gave the example in Spanish, for example. And I'm a native speaker of Portuguese, and in Portuguese we have this, it's a more gendered language because other Romance languages. And we don't need to say, for example, father and mother, because we just put the plural in the masculine. So you can say just meus pais, like my father, and it would include both of them. And this happens in most pairs. So even if you have to say the feminine, you are actually doing a bit more work already. So I think even the pairs are not as common as in English. Do you think these might have affected the fact that it didn't shift in other languages? I think would be more biased to masculine in these languages.
I mean, I'm suggesting that it's kind of a fluke from the fact that mother was so much more frequent than daddy, that it led to this slow shift. So I wouldn't necessarily expect it to occur across in any other language. You know, other shifts or other, you know, there are all kinds of things like that that have clusters that emerge over time. Like another one is the a adjective case in English, you know, like afloat, alive, aware, where they're not good before nouns, even though they're adjectives. Like it's weird to say the alive man. I mean, it happens, but it's rare. And there's a historical reason for it. They used to be prepositional phrases, and people just mirror the input that they've witnessed. And in fact, afraid never was a prepositional phrase, and it got sucked into that cluster. So I expect other clusters to exist in other languages, but I wouldn't necessarily expect female first relational terms to be common in other languages. But to your point, there is a little interesting wrinkle, which is it's true in English too, that parents, you can say, you don't have to say mother and father. And in fact, parents has become more common, especially in the context where you're aware of same-sex parents. Then parents is the more appropriate term than father and father or mother and mother, right? And it seems that there's some tendency to use father and mother in like highly religious contexts in the United States, where you kind of, I suspect that they're trying to avoid parents or even mother and father, because it might sound to them like mother's more important. So they sort of go out of their way to say father and mother, which is just not usual. But so there are some, you know, in a context, there can be functional reasons to use different things. That's definitely true. I don't think that is the explanation for this case in general, but this religious case, I do think you know, a little resurgence of father and mother is from the religious right.
Thank you.
Okay, question online from Pala Basu. I think it's got a different asymmetry that he wants your input on. So he says, and if you might be able to read this in the Q&A tab as well, but if not, I'll read it out. So a study by Sprouse reports there are two types of classes in gender asymmetries in the ellipsis. So the prince-princess class and the actor-actress class. And he wants to know if there's some relative frequency thing driving the asymmetry. So the prince-princess class is, somebody asks you, is there a prince in that photograph? You can say, yes, Prince William. You cannot say, yes, Princess Anne. So that's one class. And then there's the other one is there an actor in that photograph? You can say, yes, Robert Redford. You can also say, yes, Meryl Streep. So there's no gender asymmetry in that one. Is the case that the answer for this asymmetry lies in the relative frequency hypothesis, or is it something completely different?
Yeah, so I think, you know, actress used to be more common and people used to distinguish actor and actress very systematically, but we don't anymore. So that was I think that particular one was done intentionally. We dropped actress because it seemed to there was no reason to differentiate actor and actress. But you know, if you're going to talk about royalty, I guess you're not in the realm of the progressive, so prince and princess have remained. You know, I do think we just don't use actress as much, yeah, and that is for functional political reasons, I think.
Okay, nice to have it confirmed we're not in the realm of the progressive in the UK. How depressing.
When we talk about that, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. You've nailed it. Okay, so one more question from online, then final call for questions from the room, and then we'll wrap up. So this is from Natercia Almeida. Could a social group led by women, for example, establish an order in the use of language more linked to the feminine? Or would societies that are more advanced in terms of abandoning machismo or sexism tend towards neutrality, opting for more feminine and then masculine or the opposite? Or maybe freer.
That's such a good question. You know, I struggle with that because in the idea that it would be that it was socially more progressive to say aunts and uncles or mothers and fathers, I thought, wait, would it really be socially more progressive? Because, you know, if anything, the more important, the more agentive, the more involved person goes first. And it is the mother who is traditionally more involved and agentive in the role as a mother, right? So if it were social forces, you might expect father to be the one that was pronounced first. So that's another reason why I don't think it was social forces in this case. So, and another way to answer Natercia's question is, I think it's complicated, right? Like, you know, we probably shouldn't read too much into the order of things, although I do feel hurt when people refer to my husband and I as Ali and Adele now that I know how, you know, the implication of that. You know, but so I'm kidding, but I think, you know, in these particular cases, if you put the woman first, it almost seems to imply she's more important. She might be more agentive, but I'd rather see women first in the role of queen and king and wife and husband and so on before I would care about these cases.
Okay, brilliant. I've now got to list a bunch of people, and so that's a complete minefield in the context of this talk. But first of all, I want to start by thanking you again, Adele, for a fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's the end of this year's Edinburgh lectures in language evolution. I have to do some thanks. This is where the listing comes. So just to be explicit, I'm going to list in chronological order, except if it's to do with people contributing money, and then the people who gave us the most money go first. So thanks again to our four speakers. So that's Steve, Isabel, Balthazar, and Adele. Thanks for four fantastic, stimulating talks. Thanks to the people who funded this talk series. So that's the Centre for, I've forgotten the name, Centre for Doctoral Training in Natural Language Processing, the CDT and NLP. They provided a bunch of money, and then also there was funding from the Centre for Language Evolution. Less funding, so later mention. And then finally, the organisers. So I just turned up every Monday and got to enjoy fantastic talks and didn't do any organisation. So thanks to the organisers. So that's Henry, Maisie, Ponroy, and Sid. Okay, and also thanks to the audience for fantastic questions at the end of every set of talks. Okay, so a round of applause again for our organisers and all our fantastic speakers. And that's it. We'll hope to see you all again next year. So for the 2024 installment of this lecture series.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you, guys. Thanks very much for coming along and entertaining us and educating us.
And now we get to drink and you don't.
You're gonna receive some gifts in the post, but none of those gifts are alcohol because apparently it's too complicated to send booze internationally. So the alcohol stays in Edinburgh, I'm afraid. Thanks all very much. Cheerio.
Bye.